The ledge was maybe 4 feet wide. Below it, nothing, just the canyon dropping away in shadow, the pines 300 feet down looking like moss on a stone. Above me, the trail edge, and my brother's voice cutting through the cold air, asking if I was all right. I didn't answer right away. I was looking at what was in my hands. The satchel was dark brown leather, stiff as bark, the kind of stiff that comes from 30 years of frost and thaw and frost again. Across the flap, in stamped brass letters gone green at the edges, U.S. Mail number 7. The clasp was buckled. Both straps, not one. The way a man buckles something he means to stay buckled. The leather hadn't split. The brass hadn't given. Whatever was inside was still inside. My brother called down again. "I'm all right," I said. My voice came out quieter than I intended, the way voices do when you're holding something that doesn't belong to you. I could feel the cold coming up through my boot soles from the granite. The ledge was in full sun, the kind of October sun that's bright without being warm, that makes everything look lacquered and exact. To my left, the stagecoach pressed against the cliff face, where it had rested for longer than I'd been alive. Dark green paint, nearly black now in the creases. On the door panel, barely visible, the eagle of the U.S. Mail Service, wings spread, one talon gripping a bundle of letters, one wheel sheared clean off. The axle so rusted it looked like it had grown from the rock itself. I held the satchel against my chest and looked up at the rim of the trail. My brother's face appeared there, angular against the blue sky, watching me, the way he watches things when he's worried but won't say so. "Come on up," he said. "Just a minute." He said nothing. He knows when a minute means a minute, and when it means something else. I let my eyes go back to the coach, to the dark gap beneath the rear bench where I'd found the satchel wedged, not fallen, not slid, wedged, pushed back, with deliberate hands, into the deepest part of the hollow, and strapped shut twice over. Someone had done that. Someone had done it in a hurry, or in the last moment they had, and then the moment was gone. The canyon was absolutely still. No wind. Just the creak of my own coat in the cold. I thought about what my father used to say, that a man's last act tells you everything about him. I didn't know yet whose last act this was. I didn't know the name carved into the luggage boot behind me, or the name on any of the 11 letters folded inside that satchel. But I was going to find out. I tucked the satchel under my arm and reached for the rope. I came up the rope hand over hand, and when my boots found the trail, I stood there a moment in the thin air, with the satchel pressed against my ribs, breathing. My brother looked at it once. He looked at me once. He said nothing, which meant he understood that something had shifted, that we were no longer just two men crossing a ridge looking for a campsite. But we hadn't started here. We'd started 3 days back and 60 feet higher, and 14 miles north, on a different ledge entirely, in a different kind of cold. It was a Thursday, the 11th of October, 1883, and Miner's Notch was doing what it does in October, which is remind you that the mountains do not care whether you make it through or not. The sky was that hard, perfect blue you only get above 9,000 feet in the fall, the kind of blue that looks painted on. The aspens on the lower slopes had gone gold the week before, and now they were burning off, the last leaves spinning down into the ravines in small, slow spirals. It was beautiful, and it was cold, the kind of cold that gets into the seams of your coat and stays there. We were 14 miles north of Harlan Spine, and we were low on salt pork. Not out. Low. There is a difference, and you learn to feel it early, before the difference stops mattering. My brother had done the count that morning without saying anything, just held the tin in one hand and looked at what was left, then set it back in his pack with the same deliberate care he uses for everything. I wrote it down in my journal. Salt pork, maybe 4 days if we're careful. Hardtack holding, coffee getting short. We were picking our way along the old mail trail. a shelf cut into the cliff face by men long since dead, barely wide enough for a loaded mule, with the canyon dropping away hard to the south. The trail hadn't been maintained in years, maybe decades. Sections of it had crumbled back into the mountain. We moved slowly, testing each step, our packs riding high at 34 pounds apiece, and I was watching my footing when something caught the corner of my eye. A glint, below the trail, down the cliff face, maybe 40 feet. Not water. The angle was wrong for water. Something flat catching the afternoon light, something that didn't belong to the rock. I stopped. My brother took 2 more steps before he noticed I wasn't beside him and turned. I pointed down. He looked for a long moment. I could see him deciding whether it mattered. I already had my journal out. I sketched the cliff profile quickly, the overhang, the ledge below, the approximate position of the glint, and marked it with an X and the words, "Something on the shelf." Green? I didn't know yet what I was marking, but I've learned to write things down before I talk myself out of them. We moved back from the edge and kept walking until the trail widened to a shoulder of flat rock where 2 men could stand without their packs pulling them toward the drop. My brother set his down and looked out at the country below, the canyon running south, the aspens on the lower slopes burning yellow and orange in the late afternoon light, the dark line of a creek catching the sun somewhere far down. He didn't look at me for a while. That was how I knew he'd decided it mattered. We made camp an hour before dark, down off the spine and into a grove of aspens on the eastern slope, maybe 400 feet below the trail. The trees were the color of old coins, the ground under them was soft with leaf fall, and the trunks stood white and clean in the fading light, and I thought, this is the kind of place a man would come back to, if he could. I got a fire going with a handful of dry bark and a striker, and my brother sat against one of the aspens with his knees up and his arms resting across them, looking at the fire. I asked him what he knew about the trail up there, the carved one, the narrow one. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he knew a little, not much. Our father had mentioned it once. This would have been when we were boys, back in Durango, the winter we spent there before the house was sold. He said there had been a mail route through the San Juans in the early years, before the railroad talk started pushing everything south. Silverton down to Red Hook, with a relay post at a place called Harlan's Trading Camp, which was how the ridge got the name it kept, even after Harlan himself was gone. The coaches ran it for maybe 3 or 4 seasons in the early 50s. Then they stopped. I asked why. He picked up a stick and turned it in the fire. One coach didn't come down, he said. That was what their father had told him. Just didn't come down. They sent a man up from Red Hook the following spring, and he found the driver's horse wandering the lower trail, still wearing the harness. No coach. No driver. No mail. The route was abandoned after that. The territory didn't have the money or the men to sort out what the mountain had taken. He said it like it was just a piece of old country history, the kind of thing you hear at a trading post and half forget by the time you're back on the trail. But I had my journal open in my lap and I was looking at the sketch I'd made 2 hours earlier. The cliff profile, the overhang, the ledge, the glint of something flat and green in the afternoon light. I wrote the words, Silverton to Red Hook, below the X. Then I looked up at the aspen grove, at the firelight moving on all those white trunks, and I thought about a coach that didn't come down. We left before the trader had finished his coffee. The aspen grove was still dark when we packed up. Frost had come in hard overnight, and the ground crackled under our boots with every step. My breath hung in the air and dissolved. My brother moved without speaking, which was his way when he had already made up his mind about something and wanted no discussion of it. We climbed for 4 hours. The trail up to Harlan's Spine is not marked on any map I have ever seen. It is more of a scar, a narrow cut across the face of the mountain, where men and animals have passed often enough to scrape the rock bare, then apparently stopped passing altogether. Juniper gave way to pine, pine gave way to spruce, Spruce gave way to stone. By the time we crossed the tree line, the sky had gone from gray to that hard, particular blue you only see above 10,000 feet, and the light was so clean it made everything look closer than it was. We reached the spine at 10 minutes past 9 o'clock, on the morning of Tuesday, October the 9th, 1883. I know the time because I wrote it in my journal the moment we stopped. The ridge itself is narrow, not more than 8 feet wide at its broadest, and the trail runs along the western edge before bending south toward the RA Pass. The drop on the left was immediate and serious, the kind that does not invite inspection. I made myself look anyway. 40 feet below us, on a ledge not much wider than a flatboat, sheltered from above by a shelf of gray granite, was the coach. It was smaller than I had imagined. That was the first thought. The second was that the color was exactly right. A deep forest green, dulled and chalked by 31 winters, but unmistakably green. One rear wheel was sheared clean off at the axle. The axle itself had rusted to the color of old blood. The tongue had snapped and lay canted at an angle below the front bench, wedged against the rock. The door on the near side was still closed, still on its hinges. On the panel, faded to a ghost of itself, the eagle was visible. Wings spread, head turned right, the way they always painted it. I opened my ledger to a fresh page and began to draw. I sketched the ledge profile, the overhang above, the coach dimensions as best I could estimate from 40 feet up. I noted the wheel, the tongue, the eagle, the rust line on the axle. I wrote, "Door closed, latched or jammed." I wrote, "No sign of animal damage to the roof." I wrote the time again, 9:14 a.m. While I wrote, my brother had already moved to the gnarled pine that grew out of a crack in the ridge rock 10 feet from the edge. He was testing its trunk with both hands, checking its angle, looking down at the ledge and back up at the trunk, measuring something in his head that he did not say aloud. Then he unslung his pack and began pulling out the rope. The rope was 40 feet of hemp, coiled and carried since we'd traded for it at Durango 6 weeks prior. My brother looped one end twice around the pine's trunk, tested the knot with his full weight, then tied the other end under my arms, in a harness he cinched tight enough that I had to take shallow breaths. He didn't say much. He looked at me once, then at the ledge below, then at the knot again. That was the conversation. I went over the edge backward, walking my boots down the rock face, the way he'd taught me years before, on a limestone bluff in New Mexico. The granite here was cold and rough-surfaced, which was a mercy. It gave my soul something to push against. The rope bit across my ribs with every step. Above me I could hear my brother breathing, measured and slow, feeding the line hand over hand. The ledge came up under me sooner than I expected. I let my weight settle onto it, found it solid, 3 feet wide, maybe 4 at the widest. The rock dusted with grit and old pine needles that had blown in over 30 years. The granite overhang pressed close overhead, low enough that I had to stoop. I untied the harness and called up that I was down. My brother's face appeared at the rim, small against the blue sky. The coach filled the ledge. Up close, it was larger than it had looked from above. A full Concorde body, the kind built to carry 6 passengers and a driver, now sitting canted on its 3 remaining wheels, with the broken axle end resting on a shelf of rock. The green paint had weathered to a dull olive, cracked along the grain of the wood, and the U.S. Mail Eagle on the door panel was nearly gone. I could see it only because I was looking for it. One ghost of a wing, the curved neck. The far door was missing entirely, frame and all, torn away in the fall. I stepped through it. The interior smelled of dry rot and cold stone, and something faintly mineral, like iron left out in weather. The bench cushions had collapsed to nothing, and above me, up on the driver's box where the front of the cab opened to the seat, he was still there. The bones were seated upright, collapsed somewhat into themselves but not fallen. The high backboard of the driver's box had kept him in place through 31 winters. One hand rested in his lap. The other was on the brake lever, fingers curled around it as they had been in the last moment. I stood there and did not move for a long time. Then I stepped back outside, to the luggage boot at the rear of the coach, and crouched down to look at the ironwork. Someone had carved into the painted wood above the hasp, in letters pressed deep with a blade or a nail. J. Pruitt. I took off my hat. I stood there with my hat in my hands for a moment longer than I needed to. The wind came across the ledge and moved nothing. Everything here had stopped moving a long time ago. Then I put my hat back on and went inside. The cab was narrow and the light came through the missing door frame at a low angle, the way October light does in the afternoon, long and amber and precise, laying a bright strip across the floorboards. I stepped over what had been a cushion, now just a shape of compressed horsehair and crumbled leather. The rear bench was intact, solid, even, heavy oak, built to take weight and weather, and it had done both for 31 years without being asked to. I crouched down and looked underneath it. At first I saw only shadow, then my eyes adjusted and I saw the strap. It was buckled. Not once, twice. The second buckle was the one that told me everything. A man who does something once is doing his job. A man who does it twice is making sure. The satchel was wedged into the cavity beneath the bench, between the rear wall of the cab and the forward face of the bench frame. Wedged deliberately, angled so it could not shift, braced on two sides by the wood. Whoever had put it there had thought about where it would be safest, what position would hold it through impact, through cold, through time, and then had buckled it shut and buckled it again. I worked the second buckle free with numb fingers, then the first. The brass clasp was stiff with cold and rust, but it turned. I pulled the satchel free, and it came out heavier than I expected. The weight of paper, of words, of 11 separate lives waiting to be continued. I carried it to the door frame and passed it out through the opening into the light. My brother was waiting at the rear of the coach. He looked at what I was holding and said nothing for a moment. We climbed back up to the trail. It took effort. The ledge was frost slick and the satchel had no good place to grip. But we managed it, the two of us, the same way we managed most things. We sat in the sun on a flat shelf of granite, the satchel between us. The valley below was gold and rust, and the thin silver line of a creek. The sky was the kind of blue that only happens in October at altitude, the kind that looks like it goes on forever. He laid the satchel flat. I read the stamping aloud. U.S. Mail number 7. The eagle was still there on the flap, pressed into the leather. He undid the clasp. Inside, 11 envelopes, some darkened at the edges, some near white, all of them intact. He lifted the first one carefully and turned it over to read the address. Aloud. The name on it was gone. The ink had bled into the paper so completely that only the ghost of letters remained, a pale smear where a name had once been written with care. He set it aside and took the next. Same. The third had half a word legible at the top, something ending in son, and a town name that had gone entirely to Waterstain. We worked through them one by one, my brother reading, me watching his face. 8 of the 11 were past saving. The words were there if you held them to the light and squinted, but they were the kind of past saving that means you know something existed without knowing what it was. A life reduced to the shape of itself. The 9th envelope stopped him. It was nearly white. The paper had yellowed at the corners, and the edges carried that faint brown tide line of old moisture. But the ink, whoever had written this had pressed hard, had used good ink, had cared, was clean and dark and fully there. He turned it toward me without a word. Miss Nora Calvert, Red Hook, Colorado. And below that, in smaller letters, from Thomas Calvert, Ure. We sat with it for a moment. The wind came up the valley in a long, slow push, and moved the dry grass at the edge of the granite shelf, and then went quiet again. My brother held the envelope flat against his knee and looked at me. I nodded. He worked the flap open with his thumbnail, slowly, the way you open something you know you cannot close again. The letter was 2 pages, folded once. The handwriting was even and unhurried. A man who had learned his letters well and used them sparingly. I read it aloud because my brother asked me to, and because it felt right that the words should be heard out loud rather than only seen. Thomas Calvert had found silver, not a fortune. He said that plainly, said he wasn't writing to raise her hopes higher than the facts would hold, but a real vein, a modest one, enough to work through the winter and come out in spring with something to show. He described the color of the rock and the angle of the seam, the way the light caught it in the afternoon when the sun came level through the shaft opening. He said the other men on the claim were good men, that the camp was cold but dry, that he had enough to eat. He said he was coming home for Christmas. He said he had not been able to stop thinking about her biscuits since September. He said he missed her more than was dignified to admit in a letter, but that he was admitting it anyway. He said he would be there before the snow got heavy. He signed it. Your brother who loves you, Thomas. For a long moment after I finished reading, neither of us said anything. The letter sat in my hands. The wind moved through the pines below us and made a sound like distant water. My brother spoke first. He said the practical thing, which was what he always did. Silverton was 22 miles north. There was a postmaster there, a federal office, a man whose job it was to handle exactly this kind of thing. We could hand the satchel over, sign whatever paper he needed signed, and be done with it by nightfall tomorrow. Clean, correct. Off our backs in the most literal sense. I didn't argue right away. I let him say it out fully, because he deserved that, and because part of me knew he wasn't wrong. The satchel was a government article. The letters belonged to the Postal Service before they belonged to anyone else. We were 2 drifters with 34 pounds of gear apiece, and no particular claim to decide where 11 undelivered letters should go. But I kept thinking about the name on the envelope. I said, Red Hook is 62 miles south. He said, I know where Red Hook is. I said, she might still be alive. He looked at me the way he looked at me when he thought I was being sentimental, in a way that would cost us something. It was not an unkind look, it was just a careful one. He said, she might not be, and that was the honest center of it. I had no answer for that. 31 years was a long time. The woman named on that envelope would be past 70 if she'd had a gentle life, and past dead if she hadn't. I had nothing, no knowledge of Red Hook, no record of her, nothing, but a name written in a dead man's hand, on paper, that had spent 3 decades under a granite shelf at 11,000 feet. He waited. I said, I know I don't know. He said, then tell me why south and not north. I thought about Joseph Pruitt. I thought about the way that satchel had been buckled twice and wedged deliberate under the rear bench, while the coach was going over the edge. I thought about what a man chooses to do in the last seconds he has. I said, because the postmaster in Silverton will put it in a drawer. That letter was written for one person. If there's any chance she's still there, it ought to reach her by hand. He was quiet for longer than usual. Then he said, 62 miles is 4 days in this cold if the trail holds. I said, yes. He looked south. The sky was enormous and pale, and the aspens down the lower slope were the color of old brass in the late afternoon. He said, all right, but if we get to Red Hook and she's been in the ground for 20 years, you carry the satchel back to Silverton yourself. I said, fair. He picked up his pack. We walked south. The first morning was hard and bright. the kind of cold that sits in your back teeth when you breathe through your mouth. The trail off Harlan's Spine dropped through a scree field and then flattened into a long meadow gone rust and amber. The grasses bent over and frost burned to the root. My brother set the pace, and I kept it. The satchel rode in the top of my pack, where I could feel its weight shift slightly when I stepped over stones. A small, deliberate weight, 11 letters, and their 31 years. I wrote by firelight that first night while he slept. I wrote about Joseph Pruitt. I had been thinking about him since we climbed back up from the ledge, and I could not stop. What I kept returning to was not the dying. Men die in the mountains for any number of reasons, and the mountains do not notice. But the seconds before it, the coach going over the edge, the world tilting, the granite coming up fast, and in those seconds a man reaching under the rear bench and buckling a leather strap, not once but twice, making sure. I wrote, "What does it mean to hold your job so completely that you carry it into the last thing you do?" I did not have an answer. I left the question there on the page and went to sleep. The second day we crossed a creek at dawn, ice skinning the shallows, the center current still running black and quick. My brother went first, feeling the bottom with a stick. I handed the packs across one at a time, and then waited after. The cold so absolute it stopped feeling like cold, and started feeling like something else entirely. Presence, maybe, or attention. A mule deer watched us from 50 yards on the far bank, one ear turned toward us, absolutely still. It stood there until we had both climbed out and wrung our bootcloth dry, and then it walked, unhurried, back into the pines. I wrote that night, "The deer did not run. Maybe it understood we were carrying something and not hunting." I know that is not a rational thought. I wrote it anyway. The third day the trail climbed before it descended again, through a stand of aspen that clattered in the wind like a room full of loose tin, every leaf gone to gold or gone entirely, the white trunks bare and cool in the afternoon sun. My brother said nothing for most of the day. He walked and watched the ridgeline and let me keep my thoughts. On the fourth morning, we smelled wood smoke before we saw anything. The wood smoke meant people, and people meant a town, and the town appeared an hour later as we came down through the last of the pines onto a road that had been graded at some point. Wagon ruts smoothed and packed, the edges cut back from encroaching brush. The road ran south between low hills gone rust and gold in the October light. My brother looked at it and then at me, and didn't say anything, but he adjusted the weight of his pack and picked up his pace. Red Hook sat in a shallow bowl between two ridges, the kind of place a town happens because a valley made it easy and a road made it necessary. 200 people, maybe. A church with a white steeple that had weathered to the color of old bone. A dry goods store, a livery, a handful of houses along a single main street, and more houses scattered back behind, each with a cord of firewood, already stacked against the coming winter. Smoke from every chimney, a dog that barked twice at us from a porch and then lay back down. We went to the dry goods store because that is where you go when you need to know something about a place. A bell rang above the door. The man behind the counter was perhaps 50, broad across the shoulders, with the careful eyes of a man who has seen enough strangers to sort them quickly. He looked at our packs, at the satchel I was carrying across my chest, and he did not say anything yet. My brother asked after Nora Calvert. The storekeeper's hands stilled on the bolt of cloth he'd been folding. He set it down flat and looked at us for a moment, not with suspicion exactly, but with something more careful than that. Like a man deciding whether to open a door he hasn't opened in a while. "She's alive," he said finally. 71 years old. White House at the south end of town. Past the church, you'll see the blue door. He paused. "She had a brother," he said. "Minor, never came home. He didn't ask us why we wanted her. I think the satchel said enough. The stamped brass clasp, the faded U.S. mail, the leather dark with 31 years of cold and dust. He looked at it the way you look at something you recognize but weren't expecting to see. My brother thanked him. We went back out into the October afternoon, the sun already angling low over the western ridge, the air sharp and clean. The church steeple threw a long shadow across the road. The blue door was visible from where we stood. The blue door was weathered at its base, the paint lifting in thin curls from the wood, but the color itself still held. A good, deliberate blue, the kind a person chooses and keeps. I knocked while my brother stood back a step, the satchel across his arm. She answered slowly, a small woman, white-haired, wearing a dark wool dress with a collar buttoned to her throat. She looked at us the way old people in small towns look at strangers, not afraid, not unwelcoming, but taking inventory. Her eyes went to the satchel and stayed there. I told her our names. I told her we had come down from the San Juan High Country, from a ridge called Harlan's Spine, where a mail coach went off the trail 31 years ago. I watched her face. She did not reach for the door. She stepped back and let us in. The kitchen was clean. A window faced west, and the afternoon light came through it, level and warm, laying itself across the table like a cloth. She put water on, without asking whether we wanted any, and we sat down, and she sat across from us, with her hands folded on the table in front of her, waiting. She had been waiting a long time, and she knew how to do it. My brother set the satchel on the table and unfastened the brass clasp. He lifted out the letters one by one until he found the one addressed in a careful hand to Miss Nora Calvert, Red Hook, Colorado. He set it in front of me. She looked at the handwriting, and her hands tightened once, then went still again. I broke the wax, brittle as chalk after 31 years, and unfolded the paper. The ink had faded to a pale brown, but every word was legible. I read it aloud. It was not a long letter. Her brother Thomas had written it sitting in a bunkhouse near Ray, probably by candlelight, in the late autumn of 1852. He told her he was well. He told her the silver vein was modest but real, enough to matter. He told her he was coming home for Christmas. I said those last words and stopped. She didn't move. The afternoon light held steady on the table, on her hands, on the letter open between us. He was coming home, she said, not a question, not grief exactly, something quieter than grief, something on the far side of it, where a person goes after 31 years. My brother and I didn't speak. There was nothing to add. We had not solved anything. We had only carried a thing to the place it was always meant to arrive. We stayed the night in Red Hook, in a room above the dry goods store that the owner offered without asking for coin. I don't know what he saw in our faces when we came down from the stairs, but he didn't ask for anything. Callum slept hard. I sat by the window until the lamp burned low, listening to the town settle into quiet. A dog somewhere, a door, the wind moving through the cottonwoods along the road. We left before first light. The trail north climbed out of the valley and into the pines within the first mile, and by the time the sun cleared the eastern ridgeline, we were already above the last roofline of Red Hook. I looked back once, just the smoke rising from the chimneys, pale against the blue. Then the trees closed and it was gone. The packs were lighter, not by much. A leather satchel, 11 letters, a brass clasp, 4 or 5 pounds at most, but I felt it with every step, the way you feel a stone removed from your boot, small and exact. My brother walked ahead of me the way he always does, steady and unhurried, his breath showing white in the cold. Around mid-morning, we stopped at a creek to fill the canteens. I took out the journal. I had been trying to find the right words since the night before, turning phrases over and discarding them the way you turn stones at a ford, looking for the one that won't shift underfoot. In the end, I wrote one sentence. I looked at it for a long time, then closed the book. To carry a thing for someone who cannot carry it themselves, that is not a burden. That is what hands are for. My brother was watching me from across the creek. He didn't ask what I'd written. He just stood up, shouldered his pack, and started north again. I followed. If you've stayed with us this long, you already know what this story is about. It's not about the coach, or the letters, or even the woman sitting at the table with her hands gone still. It's about what you owe to the people who came before you, and what it costs to carry a thing all the way to the end, even when no one asked you to. My brother and I had nothing when we climbed down to that ledge. We left Red Hook with nothing, but there is a kind of lightness that only comes after you've done the thing your father would have done, and known it, in your chest, without needing to say it aloud. If the mountains have kept something you think deserves to be found, tell us in the comments. We read every one.